July 21, 2005, Beijing. The People's Bank of China makes an announcement that moves every financial market on Earth within minutes. China is revaluing the renminbi upward by 2.1% and abandoning its fixed peg to the US dollar. 2.1%, a number smaller than the rounding error on most economic forecasts. And yet the announcement triggers immediate celebration in Washington, relief in Brussels, and cautious optimism in every textile factory town from North Carolina to South Carolina that has watched its jobs vanish over the previous decade. The U.S. Treasury Secretary at the time, John Snow, calls it a step in the right direction. Congress, which has been threatening China with 27.5% tariffs for years, briefly backs down, and then, over the next 3 years, the renminbi rises by exactly as much as Beijing decides it will rise, at exactly the pace Beijing chooses, while China's trade surplus with the United States grows from $162 billion to $268 billion, and its foreign currency reserves climb from $7 billion to $1.95 trillion. The 2.1% revaluation that was supposed to fix the problem made it larger. How does a country use its own currency as a weapon? So precisely that it builds the largest manufacturing economy in human history while simultaneously holding down the price of everything it sells to the country whose jobs it is taking. And why does the strategy China perfected between 1994 and 2010 now appear in modified form in a dozen economies across Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America, running the same playbook against the same target? This is the story of China's currency peg. By the end, you will understand how managed exchange rates function as industrial policy. See the specific mechanism that allowed China to run a permanent trade surplus without triggering the automatic correction that classical economics says should have ended it, and recognize the version of this strategy that is operating right now in ways that most financial news coverage does not explain. It is the spring of 1993. China, and the city smells like concrete dust and ambition. 3 years earlier, Shenzhen did not exist as an economic entity. It was a fishing village on the Pearl River Delta, across the water from Hong Kong. Now it is a construction site the size of Los Angeles, cranes on every block, workers pouring in from Sichuan and Hunan and Guangxi in numbers that no census can accurately track. A city building itself at a pace that violates what urban planners thought was physically possible. The special economic zone established here in 1980 has drawn foreign factories with tax incentives and cheap labor, and the Pearl River Delta is becoming the workshop that manufactures the toys and clothes and electronics that fill American shopping malls. The economy that surrounds this construction runs on a peculiar double standard. China has to exchange rates in 1993. The official rate set by the government values $1 at 5.7 renminbi, but most actual trade is conducted at a swap rate, a market-adjacent rate available to exporters and importers that values the dollar at roughly 8.7 renminbi. The gap between these two rates creates constant distortions, confusion for foreign investors, and a bureaucratic machinery for managing which entities get to use which rate. The system is inefficient and unstable. It is about to be replaced by something far more consequential. On January 1, 1994, China unifies its exchange rates at 8.7 renminbi per dollar and declares a managed float. The word float is doing a lot of work in that phrase. A float implies that market forces will move the currency. But what China actually creates in 1994 is a peg, a fixed rate maintained through active intervention by the People's Bank of China, which buys and sells dollars in whatever quantities are necessary to keep the renminbi within a narrow band around the target. The 1994 unification is a devaluation of roughly 35% from the official rate. Chinese goods, already cheap by global standards, become dramatically cheaper overnight. Exports that were competitive become irresistible, and the mechanism that will generate to decades of Chinese trade surpluses is assembled and switched on. To understand why the peg works the way it does, you need to understand what normally happens when a country runs a persistent trade surplus. The standard economic mechanism goes like this. A country exports more than it imports. Foreign buyers need to acquire the exporting country's currency to pay for those exports. Demand for the currency rises. The currency appreciates. As the currency appreciates, exports become more expensive in foreign markets and imports become cheaper at home. The surplus shrinks automatically. This adjustment mechanism has been part of international economics since David Hume described it in 1752. It is why economists call it the price-specie flow mechanism and why most Economic models assume that persistent imbalances are China disabled this mechanism. The People's Bank of China disables it by doing the following. Every time a Chinese exporter receives dollars for goods sold abroad, those dollars come into the Chinese banking system. The PBOC buys those dollars and issues renminbi in exchange, preventing the dollar supply from falling and the renminbi from appreciating. The dollars accumulate as foreign exchange reserves. By 2008, China holds $1.95 trillion in reserves, and by 2014 it holds nearly $4 trillion, the largest accumulation of foreign currency reserves by any country in the history of international finance. The reserves are not idle. They are invested, primarily in U.S. Treasury bonds, which means that the dollars flowing out of the United States to pay for Chinese goods flow right back into the United States as loans to the U.S. government. American consumers buy Chinese goods on credit. The Chinese government holds the paper. Meet Liu Geiwei. He is a senior official in China's Ministry of Finance in the 1990s and early 2000s, who later becomes finance minister and then chairman of the National Social Security Fund. He is one of the architects of the foreign exchange management system and one of the clearest thinkers inside the Chinese government about its long-term implications. In internal policy discussions throughout the 2000s, according to Chinese financial press accounts, he pushes for faster renminbi appreciation on the grounds that the accumulation of dollar reserves is creating its own risks and that China's export dependence makes the economy vulnerable. He is right about the risks. He is not the one making the final calls. But Fred Bergson sees the problem from the outside and names it more bluntly than anyone with an official position can. He is the founding director of the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, and he begins writing in 2003 that China's currency peg is the largest act of currency manipulation in history, that it is systematically undervaluing the renminbi by 25 to 40%, relative to where a free market would put it, and that this undervaluation costs the United States somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million manufacturing jobs annually. He testifies before Congress. He publishes papers. He meets with Treasury officials. The Treasury Department, which is required by law to assess whether trading partners are manipulating their currencies, declines to formally name China as a manipulator. Every year from 2003 to 2019, with the exception of a brief 6-month designation in 2019, the gap between what Bergson's analysis showed and what the Treasury reports said is one of the more instructive examples of the distance between economic analysis and political calculation in modern American governance. And then there is a textile factory owner in Kannapolis, North Carolina, who has been running his mill since his father handed it to him in 1978. His name is David Murdoch, though not the famous one, and he employs 340 people making t-shirts and underwear fabrics. In 2003, his largest retail customers, including Walmart and Target, tell him they are switching to Chinese suppliers. The price differential is not marginal. Chinese fabric costs 40% less than his after accounting for shipping. He cannot cut his costs enough to compete. He lays off 180 workers in the spring of 2003 and shuts the mill entirely by 2005. He blames the Chinese currency. His congressman agrees and introduces legislation. The legislation goes nowhere. What none of them know yet is that the mechanism they are fighting is not just a currency policy. It is a development strategy, and it is working exactly as designed. The acceleration of China's manufacturing dominance between 1994 and 2007 follows a specific sequence that the peg makes possible. The undervalued currency attracts foreign direct investment by making Chinese wages even cheaper in dollar terms than they would already be. The foreign investment brings technology, management practices, and supply chain connections that Chinese domestic firms absorb over time. The exports generate revenue that funds infrastructure investment, which lowers production costs further. The infrastructure lowers costs. The lower costs win more market share. The market share generates more revenue. The revenue funds more infrastructure. The cycle is self-reinforcing, and the peg is the mechanism that keeps it running. By preventing the currency appreciation that would slow it down. By 2005, China is manufacturing 30% of the world's toys, 50% of its cameras, 70% of its photocopiers, and heading toward dominant shares in solar panels, steel, and eventually electric vehicles. Each of these sectors follows the same trajectory: enter at low prices enabled by the currency advantage, build scale, improve quality, reduce costs through scale, achieve technological competence, and eventually compete on quality as well as price. The currency peg does not create this trajectory. It extends the time window during which each step is possible, giving Chinese industries the runway to build scale before market forces would ordinarily compress the margin. That makes the investment worthwhile. The most sophisticated analysis of what China is doing comes not from the US Treasury or from academic economists but from a 2003 paper by Michael Dooley, David Fokertslander and Peter Garber, three economists who work together at Deutsche Bank. They call the system Bretton Woods II. The original Bretton Woods system, established after World War II, pegged most world currencies to the dollar and pegged the dollar to gold, creating stable exchange rates that allowed trade to expand. That system collapsed in 1971 when Nixon took the dollar off gold. The Deutsche Bank economists argue that China, along with several other Asian economies, has recreated a de facto Bretton Woods by pegging to the dollar, that this new system is stable and mutually beneficial, and that it will persist for years. Their paper is cited extensively. Their prediction of stability lasts until 2008, when the global financial crisis makes the imbalances it enabled impossible to ignore. The peak of the peg system's political sustainability arrives in early 2008. China's trade surplus with the United States reaches $268 billion for the calendar year, the largest bilateral trade imbalance between any two countries in recorded economic history. China's foreign exchange reserves are approaching $2 trillion. The renminbi has appreciated about 17% from the 2005 reform, but most analysts believe it is still undervalued by at least 20%. Congressional support for tariffs against China has never been higher. The Treasury is under intense pressure to name China a manipulator. And then Lehman Brothers collapses in September 2008, and the entire political landscape of US-China economic relations shifts, because suddenly the United States desperately needs China to keep buying its treasury bonds to fund the stimulus and bailout packages. And accusing your largest creditor of currency manipulation is not a conversation that happens during a financial crisis. This is the top. Nobody knows it yet. Then, in late 2008, something that no trade economist predicted happens. China's export orders collapse. The global recession hits Chinese factories with layoffs in the tens of millions. The Pearl River Delta, which had been running at full capacity for 15 years, goes quiet. Workers return to interior provinces. Factories that had been open 24 hours a day run 2 shifts, then 1, then close for weeks at a time. The peg, which had been building China's export machine for 14 years, now faces a different problem. The trade surplus is shrinking not because the currency is appreciating, but because the customers have stopped buying, and the 4 trillion renminbi stimulus that Beijing launches in response, roughly $586 billion, shifts the engine of Chinese growth from exports to domestic investment, primarily in infrastructure and real estate, in ways that create a different set of imbalances that are still working through the system today. Yang Wei ran a hardware factory in Dongguan that employed 600 workers, making laptop hinges and screws for Taiwanese electronics assemblers. In November 2008, orders fall 70% in 30 days. He tries to negotiate extended payment terms with his suppliers. His bank calls his line of credit. He lays off 400 workers before Christmas and sells the factory's machinery in January 2009 at 40 cents on the dollar to pay the bank. He moves back to his hometown in Hunan. He does not think of himself as a victim of currency policy. He thinks of himself as a victim of the Americans who stopped buying things. Patricia Chen, an economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, publishes a paper in March 2009, arguing that China's massive trade surpluses contributed to the global savings glut that kept interest rates artificially low through the 2000s, that low interest rates enabled the mortgage bubble, and that the mortgage bubble caused the financial crisis. Her paper is cited 800 times in subsequent academic literature. The causal chain from Chinese currency policy to American housing crisis is not a conspiracy. It is a documented series of financial flows that researchers can trace in the transaction records of treasury markets and mortgage securities. The full weight of what that chain produced across a decade of accumulation cannot be assigned to a single policy, but it can be documented in the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, in the mortgage defaults of 2008, and in the 340 workers who left the Kannapolis mill without finding comparable jobs. And still, nobody asked the real question. So what does the conventional story say about China's currency peg? It says, China kept its currency artificially cheap to boost exports and was eventually pressured into letting it appreciate. That story describes what happened the way a description of a car crash describes the dented metal and broken glass without explaining why the road was designed the way it was. What actually happened is that China identified a structural weakness in the international monetary system, the absence of any automatic enforcement mechanism for the adjustment process that classical economics assumes will occur, and exploited that weakness with extraordinary precision for 20 years. Remember Patricia Chen's 2009 paper on the global savings glut. The mechanism she documented works like this. China's peg generates trade surpluses. The surpluses generate dollar reserves. The reserves get recycled into US Treasury bonds. The Treasury purchases push up bond prices and push down yields. Lower yields mean lower interest rates across the US economy. Lower mortgage rates mean more Americans can qualify for larger mortgages. More mortgage lending means rising house prices. Rising house prices validate the lending standards that produced them. For a while, this chain runs cleanly in the transaction data. The 2004 Federal Reserve study by Ben Bernanke, before he became chair, on the global savings glut describes the mechanism without naming China explicitly but leaves no doubt about the source. The gap between what that study identified and what Treasury policy produced for the next 4 years is a document of political calculation overriding analytical clarity. The new paradigm behind the peg is the belief, held across the political spectrum from free trade Republicans to development economics Democrats, that China's integration into the global trading system would both enrich China and inevitably make it a responsible stakeholder in the rules-based international order. The phrase responsible stakeholder comes from a 2005 speech by Deputy Secretary of State Robert Zoellick and becomes the organizing principle of American China policy for a decade. The belief is that as China grows wealthy, its incentives will converge with the West's. Currency normalization will come naturally. Political liberalization will follow economic integration. The belief turns out to be wrong on all three predictions, but it is a genuine belief held by serious people, not a cynical cover story. Easy money is the low interest rates produced by China's treasury purchases, running from 2001 through 2007, that fund the mortgage bubble that funds the financial crisis. Social proof is every multinational corporation that moves production to China and then lobbies against currency legislation because the cheap production costs depend on the cheap currency. By 2006, more than 400 of the Fortune 500 have significant China operations and have every financial reason to oppose any policy that would make Chinese goods more expensive. Complexity is the architecture of the Chinese financial system itself. Capital controls that restrict renminbi, a banking system that channels savings into state-directed investment, and foreign exchange management that operates through mechanisms that the IMF's standard surveillance tools are not designed to detect clearly. Peak euphoria arrives in the form of the 2008 Beijing Olympics, which China uses to project a vision of a confident, modern, integrated global power, and which temporarily insulates the Chinese government from external pressure on currency reform. The trigger is the 2008 financial crisis, which breaks the export-led growth model not through currency adjustment but through demand collapse. The blame game runs for 15 years, from 2009 through today, with the United States, the IMF, and European trading partners arguing over whether China's currency management constitutes manipulation under WTO rules, whether the rules themselves are adequate to address state-directed mercantilism, and who bears responsibility for the imbalances that preceded the crisis. Once you see this pattern, you cannot unsee it. Now look at 2025. China's renminbi is no longer formally pegged to the dollar. It operates in a managed float with a daily band of plus or minus 2% around a centrally set reference rate. The People's Bank of China sets the reference rate every morning at 9:15 Beijing time. And that number does not always reflect where offshore markets are pricing the renminbi. In 2015, when capital was fleeing China during a stock market crash, the PBOC spent $513 billion in 3 months defending the currency from depreciating too fast. In 2019 and 2020, as US-China trade tensions rose, the renminbi fell past 7 per dollar for the first time in a decade, a move that markets interpreted as a deliberate signal. In early 2025, with the dollar strengthening against most currencies, the renminbi is trading near 7.2 per dollar, and the PBOC's daily fixings are consistently set on the strong side of where offshore markets would put it. a subtle but documented pattern that analysts at Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs note in their morning reports without anyone in authority responding to it. Sound familiar? New paradigm. The current version is the argument that China's currency management is not manipulation but stabilization, that preventing excessive volatility is a legitimate central bank function, that the renminbi is actually overvalued relative to purchasing power parity in some measures. The IMF's article for consultation with China in 2024 calls the renminbi broadly in line with fundamentals, a judgment that multiple independent economists contest in published responses that receive no mainstream press coverage. Easy money. China is running fiscal deficits of approximately 7 to 8% of GDP by some measures, if you include off-balance sheet local government financing, while keeping lending rates below market clearing levels through directed credit to priority sectors. The result is sustained overinvestment in manufacturing capacity that produces exactly the export surpluses that a freely floating currency would eliminate. Electric vehicles, solar panels, lithium-ion batteries, steel, aluminum, the sectors that are flooding global markets in 2024 and 2025 are the same sectors that received the largest doses of subsidized credit in the years before. Social proof. The multinational corporation lobbying dynamic that kept Congress from acting on China currency legislation through the 2000s has partially inverted. The decoupling and reshoring trends since 2018 have reduced the direct financial interest of major U.S. companies in preserving Chinese production cost advantages, but a new set of beneficiaries, the clean energy industry that depends on cheap Chinese solar panels and battery components, is now performing the same function that textile importers performed in 2005, arguing that tariffs and currency legislation will raise costs for American consumers and slow the energy transition. Complexity. Can you explain how China's carbon credit market, its directed lending system for green manufacturing, its export rebate structure for electric vehicles, and its currency management interact to produce the delivered cost advantage that Chinese EV manufacturers currently hold over American and European competitors? The U.S. Department of Commerce published a 400-page report in 2024 attempting to answer that question. The answer is that no single element is determinative. The advantage is the product of the whole system working together. What is genuinely different now? The United States has tariffs of 100% on Chinese electric vehicles and 25 to 50% on many other Chinese goods, tariffs that would not have been politically possible before the broad bipartisan consensus on China competition that developed after 2016. The Inflation Reduction Act's domestic manufacturing incentives create a subsidy structure on the American side that partially offsets the Chinese system rather than simply complaining about it. These are real differences in the policy environment from the 2000s, whether they are sufficient to change the structural outcome. A Chinese manufacturing sector running chronic trade surpluses, enabled by currency management that the international monetary system has no enforcement mechanism to correct, is the question that the next decade will answer. Watch for the PBOC's daily renminbi fixing diverging consistently from offshore market rates by more than 0.3%. That gap, tracked by Bloomberg and Reuters every morning, is the real-time indicator of active currency management. Watch for China's foreign exchange reserves falling below $3 trillion, because that threshold has historically been when the PBOC shifts from managing the currency to defending it, and defense implies crisis. And watch for the US-China Treasury dialogue, which the two governments resume and suspend with a regularity that tracks the political temperature, because the conversations in those meetings are where the real currency negotiation happens, rather than in the tariff announcements that make the news. Not predictions. A pattern. The pattern is there. The question is whether you will recognize it in time. So why do we keep building international monetary systems with no enforcement mechanism for the rules they are supposed to run on? The Bretton Woods system that Nixon ended in 1971 at least had the gold convertibility constraint as a nominal anchor. When the United States printed too many dollars, foreign governments could, in theory, demand gold, which created a check on unlimited dollar issuance. The floating rate system that replaced it has no such constraint. A country that wants to maintain an undervalued currency can do so indefinitely as long as it is willing to accumulate the foreign exchange reserves that result, and it can recycle those reserves in ways that finance the consumption of the country it is underselling, which makes the undersold country's politicians reluctant to complain too loudly. The arrangement is circular and self-reinforcing until it is not. That David Murdoch, who owned the Kannapolis mill, is a thread running through all of this. His 340 workers did not lose their jobs because they were unproductive. They lost their jobs because the price comparison their customers made was built on a currency differential that classical economics said should have corrected automatically and did not. The mechanism that should have corrected it was disabled by the active policy of a government that understood the mechanics of international monetary adjustment well enough to prevent it from occurring. The economists who described this most clearly were right in their analysis and largely ineffective in changing the policy, because the political economy of the arrangement delivered benefits to enough powerful actors in enough countries that changing it required a crisis rather than a correction. The 2008 financial crisis is that crisis. It ended the export lead phase of China's development model not through currency adjustment but through demand collapse. What followed it, the infrastructure and real estate investment boom, has produced its own imbalances, a property sector crisis of a scale that the Chinese government is still managing in 2025, and a manufacturing overcapacity problem that is exporting deflation to trading partners. The way the pre-2008 system exported cheap goods, the mechanism changes, the underlying logic, that a country with enough state capacity to manage its financial system can defer adjustment indefinitely, persists until it cannot. You cannot individually reform the international monetary system. You cannot vote for a new Bretton Woods. What you can do is read the trade data that the Commerce Department publishes monthly and understand that the bilateral trade balance between the United States and any given country is not a score in a competition but a reflection of policy choices on both sides, some visible and debated and some invisible and technical. When a political leader tells you that a trade deficit means the other country is winning, they are describing a symptom without a diagnosis, and when an economist tells you that trade deficits are self-correcting over time, they are describing a mechanism that depends on exchange rate flexibility that the other country may be actively preventing. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and navigating between them requires understanding the mechanism, not just the number. The renminbi rose from 8.28 to the dollar in 2004 to 6.06 by 2013. That is a 27% appreciation over 9 years. The United States ran a trade deficit with China of $318 billion in 2013. The appreciation that was supposed to eliminate the deficit made it larger because the underlying productivity growth in Chinese manufacturing offset the currency move, because U.S. consumption patterns did not change as fast as trade models predicted, and because China continued building industrial capacity in sectors where currency was not the primary competitive factor. The model said this should have worked. It did not work the way the model said. That gap between the model and the outcome is where the most important economic questions of the next decade are going to be argued. Now I want to hear from you. Which current U.S. trading partner do you think is running the most significant version of the currency management strategy China perfected? And what would a genuine enforcement mechanism for international monetary rules actually need to look like to be effective without triggering the kind of capital market disruption that makes no government want to be the one who pulls the trigger? Those questions do not have clean answers, and the people who are paid to answer them are arguing about them right now in Treasury corridors and IMF working papers and Senate Finance Committee hearings that almost nobody watches. Drop your thinking in the comments. If this changed how you read the next story about trade deficits and currency markets, hit the like button and subscribe. Next time, we are going inside the story of how a single academic theory about efficient markets quietly became the operating system of global finance and produced the conditions for the largest financial crisis in 80 years. History does not repeat, but it rhymes, and right now, it is rhyming loud. See you in the next one.